Billings offers 5 categories of feature leads. Keep in mind that an excellent lead may combine 2 or more categories. The first is a statement lead, but not just any statement. Make it a strong, provocative, or intriguing statement. Now, the statement should also use contrast, color, or surprise for additional impact. Then you have the narrative or anecdote lead, meant to grab the reader's attention by placing them in the middle of the action. These tell an eyewitness account, either by the reporter or by the source, as to what is happening. The description or scene setting lead does as it implies. It sets the scene for the reader. The lead is not as action-packed as a narrative or anecdote lead, instead relying on colorful, vivid language to describe what the reader should see, hear, smell, taste, or feel. A feature lead can ask a question designed to intrigue the readers and make them think. Now, this type of lead is less popular than the first 3, as the writer needs to make sure the right question is asked, or risk boring and alienating the readers. Now, remember, we already know that "did you know" is the worst question of all. A second type of lead that is typically avoided in news writing, but can be acceptable for features, is the quote lead. Now, again, we already learned that the quote lead often doesn't fairly summarize the story and can be an opinion rather than a fact. That's why even in feature writing, the quote lead can be used, but should be used sparingly. Let's take a look at some of these leads in action from student journalists across the country. The first is a statement lead. When Allie Scheisel, a freshman double majoring in English literature and writing for new media, was asked if she identified as a feminist, Scheisel responded without hesitation, "I do." This lead is from the story Feminism, Not a Dirty Word, published in Arch's student newspaper from Mount Mary University in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and was a finalist for an award for Best Diversity Story from the Associated Collegiate Press. The lead is a simple, declarative statement that helps set the tone for the story, which includes information on how some people are hesitant to accept the label as feminist. For this and the next few examples, you can click on the image to be linked to the entire article. Now, I strongly encourage you to do so with this one, regardless of how you might personally feel about the topic, as the story itself is very well designed, with alternative copy boxes, including quotes, timelines, and suggested future readings. Here is an anecdotal lead. Sammy Miller found herself struggling to shake intrusive thoughts of suicide in her dorm room one night during her freshman year. And the second paragraph. Diagnosed with depression, anxiety, and borderline personality disorder, Miller knew what was happening. She called her therapist, who urged her to hand over her antidepressants to the building's front desk so she wouldn't be tempted to overdose. This lead is from the story Searching for Care, published in the Minnesota Daily from the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis, and won an award for Best Feature Story from the Associated Collegiate Press. Now, this lead starts with Sammy's story about dealing with mental illness, setting the tone for the rest of the story, which delves deeper into the experience. Sammy and 3 other University of Minnesota students are balancing mental illness with school. The story also has some good alt copy boxes, mainly showing statistics that are important to share, but might bore the reader if the text was filled with lots of numbers and comparisons. Showing them visually can be much more appealing and informative. Finally, we'll take a look at a descriptive lead. First, there is silence. Then a syrupy wave of synthesizer keys and jangling beats bounces in. It begins slowly before starting its patient ascent. The intensity builds, each click of the key and each clunk of the percussion gaining momentum. A voice interrupts. It's your move, it beckons. It is a smooth, sexy, and sensual invitation, enticing as it is hypnotic. This lead is from the story Vaporwave is the online-only music genre you've never heard of, from Eldon at Santa Ana College in California, one of the top community college newspapers in the country. This lead helps introduce the reader to a relatively new electronic music genre called Vaporwave by detailing how a song might sound. You can click through to hear some song samples and see if they fit with what the lead describes. Moving into the body of the story, you start with the nut graph. This is typically found right after the lead paragraph. Now, the nut graph gives a focus to the story. In other words, the nut graph is the story in a nutshell. Let's take a look at the nut graph for one of our example stories, Searching for Care, from the Minnesota Daily. After getting to know Sammy Miller a little, we learn at the University of Minnesota, 1 in 3 students report having been diagnosed with a mental illness in their lifetime. The school, like many others nationwide, has expanded its mental health resources to meet rising demands. Now, this paragraph tells us the story won't just be about Sammy, but about other U of M students, how they deal with their diagnosis, and how they interact with the university's health system. So, what can be part of a feature story? You can start with the facts. Information you have gathered about your subject during your research. Now, you may have anecdotes, stories about a person's relationships, where they're from, or their hobbies. You can include your observations, either about the subject or about an issue. Now, you're bound to have quotes, either things that your subject said or things that others said about your subject. And finally, you might have some statistics to share, numbers, percentages, or trends. To put all that information into a readable feature story, start by organizing the information into paragraph clusters. Your basic facts and observations, your supporting facts, anecdotes and statistics, and quotes. Now, using this method, you can start to organize your content into paragraphs, like so, until you either run out of content or run out of space in your story. Now it's time to end with the ending. Now, in our lecture on writing news, we learned the purpose of an ending is to tell the reader the story is over, nail the central point of the story to the reader's mind, and resonate with the reader. It's the same for features, and writers can end their stories in a few different ways. Now, first is the tieback ending, sometimes called the circle ending because it circles back to the lead. Now, the story ends with a similar statement, anecdote, description, question, or quote that started it to help give the lecture unity. Next is the surprise ending. Now, in news writing, we'd call this a kicker, something memorable or surprising that rewards the reader for sticking through until the end. Now, this is one way that features and news writing differ, as a news story written using the inverted pyramid style would not leave such a juicy tidbit for the end of the story, where it might be easily cut. Finally, you can use a summary ending. Now, these are commonly found in news and issue features and editorials, summarizing the key points in the story and focusing on the impact or outcome to emphasize the point of the story that is trying to make. We'll look at one example of a feature ending. Now, remember the lead for Searching for Care. Here's how the story ends. After graduating with a degree in psychology, Sammy Miller hopes to work as a therapist or mental health advocate. "I want to help people," Miller said. "When you experience this, you don't want it to happen to anyone else. Now, this is a great example of a tieback ending, bringing the story back around to Sammy's story and how she wants to use her own experience with mental illness to help others. Just as there are good ways to end a feature story, there are also some bad ones. Now, the journalism education website cubreporters.org urges reporters to avoid the sermonette ending, an ending you'd likely find in a religious sermon. Now, here are two examples from Cub Reporters. Now, both examples end with a reporter's opinion on how well a young model would do with her career and how difficult it might be for college students to find a job after graduation. Now, unless you're writing an opinion article, keep your opinion to yourself.